The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning. It was not preceded by a phone call, an email, or any gentle warning. That detail matters to me, perhaps more than it should, because it underscores the precise geometry of my isolation. I remember standing at my aluminum mailbox in the biting November cold. I was still wearing my wire-rimmed reading glasses from breakfast, my breath clouding in the crisp, indifferent air while I sorted through the usual debris of an invisible life. Utility bills, glossy grocery circulars, a thick catalog for high-end woodworking tools I would never buy because I no longer had the right to build anything real. Then, sitting heavy at the bottom of the stack, there it was, a thick, cream-colored envelope, the paper possessing a weight and texture that demanded attention. The return address was embossed, sharp and black against the cream. Hargrove and Blythe, attorneys at law, Nashville, Tennessee. I didn't recognize the firm, but I recognized the city. I stood there on the cracked concrete sidewalk for a long, quiet moment, just holding it. The edges of the envelope dug slightly into my thumb. Eleanor lived in Nashville now. She had for the past 11 years, having relocated her empire after the dust of our ruined lives had settled. I didn't open it out there in the cold. Instead, I walked slowly back inside my apartment, set the envelope down exactly in the center of my kitchen table, and finished the last half cup of my black coffee. I drank it slowly. At 62 years old, having survived what I had survived, I had learned a fundamental truth about the mechanics of the world. Bad news does not get any worse for waiting. It simply waits. The table wobbled slightly when I set my ceramic mug down. One wooden leg was a 1/4 inch shorter than the others. I had been meaning to fix it for 3 years, ever since I moved into this small place in Charlotte. I had the shims. I had the tools. I never did it. There is a specific kind of inertia that takes hold of a man when he realizes he is the only one who will ever sit at that table. Finally, I slid a butter knife under the flap and opened the envelope. The letter inside was brief, impeccably formatted, and professionally devoid of any human warmth. It stated my full legal name, Victor Callahan. I was being formally contacted by the law offices of Hargrove and Blythe regarding the estate of Eleanor Hartley Callahan. The estate. I stopped reading for a second, my eyes catching on the next line. Eleanor Hartley Callahan, who had passed away on October 29th following a brief illness. She was dead. The words sat on the page, blunt and immovable. I was named in her will. My presence was officially requested at the formal reading, scheduled for the following Friday, November 14th, in Nashville. The letter made it explicitly clear that this was not a courtesy invitation. It was not optional. The specific nature of the bequest required my physical attendance. I read the single page twice, parsing the legal terminology the way I used to parse load-bearing calculations on steel blueprints. Then I set it down beside my empty mug. Eleanor was dead, my ex-wife. The woman I had once, with absolute and foolish certainty, believed was the other half of everything I was. The woman my only son hadn't spoken to me about in 12 years, without a thick, suffocating layer of contempt in his voice. The woman who had risen from nothing, survived a scandal that should have buried her, gone on to build a real estate and hospitality empire worth somewhere north of $250 million. She was gone. I sat in that silent kitchen for a very long time. I watched the pale November light crawl across the cheap linoleum floor in slow, agonizing degrees. My mind drifted back, pulling up images from a time when the world wasn't broken. I thought about who she had been before the money, before the empire, before the lie. We had met at Georgia Tech. I was a teaching assistant, finishing up a grueling graduate degree in civil engineering. She was an undergrad studying business administration. She was working 20 hours a week behind the front desk of a mid-tier hotel downtown, just to cover the cost of her textbooks. I noticed her immediately. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she was. It was a specific quality she possessed, a profound, anchoring stillness in difficult moments. It was a steadiness that looked completely effortless to the untrained eye. But as an engineer, I knew that kind of structural integrity required immense internal tension. I learned later that she had grown up bitterly poor, the eldest of 4 children, to a father who drank and a mother who disappeared into her own mind. Eleanor had trained herself not to panic, because in her house, if someone didn't hold the walls up, the roof would cave in. We got married when I was 28 and she was 26. We had absolutely nothing. Our first apartment was a shoebox over a noisy street. We were genuinely incandescently happy. I believed in her vision completely. When Andrew was born 3 years later, it was a simple, logical decision for me to step back. I was the one who handled the early years. I mastered the diaper changes, memorized the pediatrician's schedules, and stood outside the elementary school waiting for the bell to ring. A job as a municipal engineer gave me predictable hours, while Eleanor was busy breathing life into a small property management company she had, started with $15,000 and a refurbished laptop. By the time Andrew was 12, her Hartley Group was managing commercial properties across the Southeast. By the time he was 16, she was developing them. The money came like a flash flood. We moved from our modest ranch house in Decatur to a sprawling, gated home in Buckhead. Andrew was enrolled in an elite private school. I made senior engineer at my firm. Everything was structurally sound. Everything was working perfectly. Until it wasn't. I have gone over the sequence of events in my mind so many thousands of times that the memories have worn smooth, like stones trapped in the current of a river. I could recite the timeline in my sleep. Eleanor partnered with a man named James Whitfield. They over-leveraged heavily into a massive mixed-use development deal in Chattanooga. It was supposed to anchor a revitalized riverfront. Then, the economy hiccuped, the anchor retail tenant abruptly pulled out, and the financial scaffolding of the project began to loudly, violently snap. Eleanor panicked. The woman who never panicked. She began moving money illegally. She shifted investor funds between completely separate accounts, borrowed heavily against assets she didn't legally control, and papered over massive, gaping holes in the books. She told herself it was a temporary patch, just a bridge loan to herself, to keep the project breathing. Then the SEC opened a federal inquiry. I remember the night she told me. We sat at our heavy, solid oak kitchen table in Buckhead. She laid it all out. It wasn't just her company on the line. It was her investors, James Whitfield's reputation, and Andrew's entire future. My name was legally tied to several of the business accounts as her husband and co-signer. She didn't ask me to take the fall. She just wept. But I looked at her, and I thought of our 17-year-old son upstairs, so proud of his mother, so certain of his privileged place in the world. I thought about what a federal fraud conviction would do to the girl who used to work night shifts at a hotel just to buy textbooks. So, I engineered a solution. I went to the federal investigators and confessed. I told them I had manipulated the accounts independently. I told them Eleanor had trusted me, and I had secretly misused that trust to play the market. I had the access, and on paper, I had the ability. I answered their questions steadily. I didn't waver. The collapse of my life was absolute. I lost my engineering license. I was convicted of securities fraud. I served 26 months in a federal correctional facility in Macon, Georgia. I went into prison at 50, and when I walked out at 53, the world had entirely rearranged itself to close the hole where I used to be. Eleanor had filed for divorce 14 months into my sentence to protect the company's remaining assets. She visited me twice. She promised to take care of Andrew. But Andrew had already decided who I was. His mother never spoke against me, but she didn't have to. The facts were damning enough. His father was a thief, a liar, a man who betrayed his family for greed. I spent the next decade trying to be his father from the outside. I attended his law school graduation, sitting in the very back row, slipped out before the applause ended. I sent cards. I called on his birthdays. I rebuilt a meager life doing unlicensed consulting work, sketching community centers and bridges in my spare bedroom. Buildings that would never exist, drawn by a man who didn't exist anymore to the people he loved most. Eleanor was dead. The woman I had sacrificed my name for was gone. The silence in my kitchen was deafening. The letter demanded I go to Nashville, but there was something else I had to do first. I stared at the phone on the kitchen counter for 10 minutes. I knew exactly how the call would go. We had played this exact script out for 12 years. But he had just lost his mother, and I was still his father. I picked up the receiver and dialed the Chicago area code. It rang 3 times.
Andrew Callahan.
Andrew, it's Dad.
I figured it might be you. I assume you got the notification from Hargrove and Blythe?
I got the letter in the mail this morning. Andrew, I am so deeply sorry.
Thank you. It was pancreatic. It moved incredibly fast. By the time they found it in late August, there wasn't much anyone could do.
Late August? Andrew, you should have told me she was sick. I would have.
You would have what? What exactly would you have done? She had the best oncologists in the state. She had her board of directors, her friends, and she had me. We handled it.
I know you did. I know you took care of her. But I'm still your father, and she was my wife once. I should have known.
You lost the right to be kept in the loop about this family's affairs a very long time ago. Let's not pretend otherwise today, all right? I don't have the energy for it.
I'm not trying to pretend anything, Andrew. I just wanted to call, to hear your voice, to ask how you are holding up.
I'm handling the estate logistics. The partners are panicking. The board is trying to stabilize the stock, and the media is hovering. I am extremely busy.
You're working. You always work when you're hurting. You get that from her.
Please don't analyze me. And please don't compare me to her in a way that implies you understand either of us anymore.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to overstep.
Look, the attorney said you have to be there on Friday. I tried to tell them it was unnecessary, that whatever token amount she left you could just be wired. But they insisted she put a physical attendance clause in the will.
I'll be there. I'm driving to Nashville tomorrow evening.
Fine. The reading is at 10 in the morning. Don't be late. It's going to be a closed room, just the executive partners and me.
Do you need me to help with anything once I get into town? I can sort through the house, handle the smaller things, so you can focus on the lawyers.
Absolutely not. The house is locked down and her staff is handling the packing. I don't want you anywhere near her things or the company's files. Just show up at the firm, listen to the reading, sign whatever waiver they put in front of you, and go back to Charlotte.
Andrew, I know you're in pain. I know you are angry. But you don't have to carry all this by yourself.
I am not carrying it by myself. I have a life here. I have colleagues. I am doing exactly what needs to be done.
Okay, I understand.
Are we done here? I have a conference call with the probate judge in 4 minutes.
We're done. I love you, son.
I'll see you on Friday.
The line clicked, severing the connection, leaving me listening to the sterile dial tone. It was exactly 4 minutes. I slowly placed the receiver back onto the cradle. He sounded so much like her, disciplined, controlled, refusing to show a single millimeter of weakness. I walked into my bedroom, pulled a small canvas duffel bag from the closet, and began to pack for Nashville, preparing to face the ghosts I had spent the last 12 years trying to bury. I drove to Nashville on Thursday evening, the sky bruising into a deep bruised purple as I crossed the state line. I took the interstate, tires of my old sedan humming a monotonous rhythm against the asphalt. With every mile marker that passed, I felt the phantom weight of the past pressing down on my chest. I hadn't been back to this city since before my trial, before the trial that wasn't really a trial, but a carefully orchestrated surrender. Nashville had grown in my absence. The skyline jutted up against the horizon, thick with new glass and steel. Cranes hovering over half-finished skeletons of buildings like massive steel birds. Eleanor's buildings, I imagined. I checked into a mid-range hotel just off the highway. A sterile room with bolted-down art and a heavy hum from the air conditioning unit. I lay awake for most of the night, staring up at the popcorn ceiling, tracing the irregular patterns in the plaster. I tried to imagine what Eleanor could possibly have left me. After 12 years of absolute silence, what could be said? I convinced myself it was a token. A watch, perhaps, or a modest sum to signal some distant, sterile acknowledgement that I had once existed in her orbit. A gesture. I found a strange comfort in that assumption. Gestures were manageable. Gestures didn't require me to dismantle the quiet, solitary life I had painstakingly built in the wreckage of my old one. The next morning, I put on the only suit I owned, a charcoal two-piece I had bought off the rack for a court appearance years ago, tailored slightly to fit the weight I had lost and never put back on. The offices of Hargrove and Blythe were located on the 21st floor of a sleek, intimidating glass tower in the heart of downtown. I rode the elevator up in silence, surrounded by polished young professionals who smelled of expensive espresso and ambition. When the polished steel doors parted, I stepped into a reception area wrapped in dark wood and frosted glass. I gave my name to the receptionist. Her eyes flicked up, registering something, before she politely guided me down a long carpeted hallway. The conference room was cavernous. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the city spread out below, a sprawling kingdom of commerce and concrete. The morning light poured in, harsh and unforgiving. Around the long, polished mahogany tables sat several people I didn't recognize. They had the distinct, unmistakable aura of wealth managers, senior partners, corporate advisors, Eleanor's people. They spoke in hushed, serious tones, their briefcases open, files neatly stacked. And there, at the far end of the table, just setting down his phone, was my son. Andrew looked up as I crossed the threshold. He was 40 years old now, and he wore his age with an elegant, formidable armor. He was handsome in the sharp, angular way his mother had been, possessing that exact same quality of preternatural stillness. He looked like the most composed person in the room, perhaps in the entire building. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit. A heavy silver watch caught the morning light as he shifted his hands. When his eyes met mine, his face went carefully, perfectly neutral. A vault locking its doors. "Dad," he said. The word hung in the air. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It was simply a vocalization of a biological fact. "Andrew," I replied, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. I pulled out a heavy leather chair near the opposite end of the table and sat down. We did not speak again. A few moments later, the lead attorney entered the room. Her name was Rebecca Torres. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, sharp, precise, moving with an economy of motion that commanded immediate respect. She carried a thick leather document folder and, strangely, a separate, heavy steel lockbox which she placed at the head of the table with meticulous care. She cleared her throat, thanking everyone for their attendance. She explained, with practiced solemnity, that Eleanor had left highly specific, non-negotiable instructions regarding the order of the reading today. She asked that all parties hold their questions until the end of the proceeding. I glanced at Andrew. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms loosely over his chest. He looked entirely unbothered, like a man waiting for a train he had already calculated the arrival time for. He knew the empire was his. He was just waiting for the paperwork to make it official. Rebecca began to read. For the first 20 minutes, the language was standard, dense with legal boilerplate. There were generous charitable bequests to local hospitals. There were substantial financial gifts to longtime employees and household staff. There was a massive scholarship endowment established at the university Eleanor had attended at night while working her way up from the hotel front desk. Through it all, Andrew nodded occasionally, his expression one of patient, benevolent approval. He was the crown prince watching the final, generous decrees of the queen. Then, Rebecca turned a page. She paused, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. As an engineer, You learn to spot the moment the structural load shifts. To my son, Andrew Hartley Callahan, Rebecca read, her voice steady and clear, I leave the sum of $500. The room went entirely, violently still. It was the kind of silence that follows a detonation. The executives at the table stopped breathing. Andrew uncrossed his arms. The mask of perfect composure slipped just a millimeter, revealing a flash of absolute bewilderment. Something volatile moved behind his eyes, a rapid calculation of error. Excuse me, he said quietly, his voice dangerously low. There must be a typographical error. There is no error, Rebecca said softly. There is more. Your mother left a letter. She specified, under strict legal condition of the estate, that it be read aloud, in its entirety, to all parties present. She reached for the steel lockbox, inputted a code, and the latch clicked open. She reached inside and withdrew several pages of heavy stationery, handwritten in dark blue ink, protected in clear plastic sleeves. She laid them on the mahogany table and smoothed the first page with the palm of her hand. I watched Andrew watch her do this. I watched his jaw clench, the muscles leaping under his skin. Rebecca began to read Eleanor's letter. Immediately, her voice changed, adopting the measured, deliberate cadence I still recognized in my bones from 20 years of marriage. To those present today, the letter began, I have spent the last 12 years building something I was profoundly proud of, but I find I am not able to leave this world without finally acknowledging what this empire was built upon. It was not just my own effort, my own vision, or my own relentless drive. Those things are real, and I claim them. This was also built on something I should have claimed long ago and cowardly did not: a debt. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I gripped the armrests of my chair, a sudden cold dread washing over me. No, Eleanor, no. I had spent 12 years keeping the dam intact, and now she was blowing it apart from the grave. On the night of March 8, 2008, Rebecca continued, reading Eleanor's elegant script, I made a series of desperate financial decisions that constituted federal fraud. I moved millions in investor funds between restricted accounts without authorization. I falsified structural financial records. I told myself it was temporary. It was not temporary. It was a crime. And when the investigators began to look, I was terrified. I was going to lose everything. A collective gasp rippled through the executives at the table. The legal implications of what was being read were staggering. My eyes were locked on Andrew. The color was draining from his face, leaving him ashen, his eyes wide and fixed on the attorney. My husband, Victor Callahan, took the blame for what I did, the letter stated. The words dropped like anvils onto the table. He was not the one who moved the money. He was not the one who falsified the books. He had legal access to those accounts, only because I had given it to him, because I trusted him implicitly. And he used that access to construct a flawless story that protected me. He went to a federal penitentiary for 26 months for a crime I committed. He lost his engineering license, a brilliant career he had spent 30 years building. He lost his marriage, his daily relationship with his only son, what should have been the best years of his professional life. And God help me, I let him do it. The air in the room felt too thin to breathe. I couldn't swallow. I stared at the wood grain of the table, unable to look at my son. I told myself I would find a way to secretly repay him. Rebecca read, Eleanor's posthumous voice breaking through the silence. I told myself that by building this company to astronomical heights, by ensuring Andrew had every conceivable advantage in life, by making the settlements with the investors, whole, and then some, I was balancing the scales. I was making it right. I was not making it right. I was simply making myself feel better about a truth I did not have the courage to face. Andrew, Rebecca paused, looking up briefly at my son before looking back at the page. Andrew, your father is not the man I allowed you to believe he was. Everything you decided about him, his perceived weakness, his selfishness, his criminal failure, was decided on the basis of a massive lie that I permitted to stand. Your father is the most fundamentally decent person I have ever known. He sacrificed everything he had, his entire identity, without ever being asked. And he never told you, never defended himself to you, because he believed that protecting the pristine image of your mother in your eyes was more important than his own reputation. He was wrong to make that choice, but I was far more wrong to let him. This is the only honest thing I have left to give you. The truth. It is late. It is painfully insufficient. I am so deeply sorry. Rebecca set down the final page. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic whir of the ventilation system hidden in the ceiling. Andrew was staring blankly at the table in front of him. The invincible stillness he always carried had completely fractured. It was replaced by a different kind of stillness, the rigid, terrified paralysis of someone who has just stepped off a cliff and is waiting for gravity to take hold. "That's not possible," Andrew whispered. His voice was entirely stripped of its usual baritone authority. It was flat, hollow, the voice of a frightened boy. "She was not. She wouldn't do that. This doesn't make any sense." "There is more, Andrew," Rebecca said gently. She reached back into the steel box and produced a small silver hard drive and a sealed envelope. "Your mother anticipated your disbelief. She prepared a sworn video statement 4 months before her death, legally witnessed by 2 independent attorneys and a notary public. She also commissioned, at her own expense, independent forensic accounting review of the 2008 transactions. The hard drive contains irrefutable digital evidence that the fraudulent pattern of activity originated entirely from her private terminals on dates and times when your father was thoroughly documented to be on municipal work, sites miles away." Rebecca set a sleek tablet on the table, connected the drive, and pressed play. The video began without ceremony. Eleanor appeared on the screen. She was seated at her heavy desk in her home office. I recognized the warm amber lighting. She had aged terribly in the years since I had last seen her. The cancer was already hollowing out her cheeks, rendering her skin paper thin, but her eyes, those dark, calculating, fiercely intelligent eyes, were brilliantly clear, and her voice, when she spoke, possessed the same unshakable steadiness that had made me fall in love with her 3 decades ago. "Andrew," Eleanor's digital ghost said, looking directly into the camera, "you're going to want to believe this isn't real. You are a lawyer. Your instinct will be to litigate this, to find the flaw in the argument. You've organized your entire adult life, your entire identity, around a version of events that made logical sense to you, and I am asking you to tear all of that down. I know exactly how much that costs a man. I'm asking you anyway. Your father went to prison because he loved us. He went into a cell so you could go to the Ivy League. He came home, a convicted felon, and rebuilt a solitary life from nothing. And he never once called you to set the record straight because he decided you're high. Opinion of me mattered more to your development than your opinion of him. That was his choice. It was a better, purer choice than anything I made during that entire dark period of my life. I am telling you the undeniable truth now because I am dying, and I refuse to let you spend the rest of your life treating a truly great man like a stranger." The screen went black. The video ended. Andrew pushed his heavy leather chair back from the table. It made a loud scraping sound against the carpet. For a terrifying moment, thought he was going to bolt. I thought he was going to walk out of the room the way a man does when the emotional walls close in and the air becomes toxic. He stood there, his large hands gripping the back of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. He stared at the blank screen of the tablet, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. "She's been gone 3 weeks, he choked out, his voice cracking violently. "I buried her, and she's sitting here. She's telling me." He couldn't finish the sentence. He squeezed his eyes shut. Becca waited a respectful moment before speaking again. Her voice was quiet but firm, bringing the room back to the legal reality of the moment. Your mother's remaining estate, after the specified minor bequests and charitable gifts are executed, currently valued at approximately $240 million in liquid assets, commercial holdings, and diversified investment accounts. She turned her gaze to me. For the first time in the entire surreal proceeding, I felt the massive room tilt dangerously on its axis. My stomach dropped. She has left the entirety of it to your father, Rebecca stated clearly, with one single, binding condition. She picked up the final sheet of paper. To Victor Callahan, I leave everything I have built, the strict understanding that it should be used to do some actual good in this broken world. You were always better at that than I was, Victor. You knew what buildings were for. You knew how people lived in them. I only ever knew what they were worth on paper. The one legal condition of this entire bequest is this. You must find James Whitfield. You must look him in the eye and make sure he knows I am sorry. You must make sure he and his family are taken care of, financially, for the rest of their lives. Beyond that execution, the rest is yours. Do something real with it, Victor. You always knew how. I couldn't speak. My throat was paralyzed. I sat frozen in my chair, a 62-year-old disgraced engineer who lived in a sparse apartment and bought generic coffee, suddenly being handed $240 million by a woman who had been dead for 3 weeks. I couldn't make a single coherent word form on my tongue. The weight of it was astronomical. It wasn't money. It was a monument of guilt and restitution. Andrew's voice finally broke the heavy silence. The anger, the cold professionalism he had worn like armor for over a decade, had completely drained out of him. What was left was raw, bleeding confusion. He turned slowly and looked at me. Really looked at me, focusing on my face for the first time since he was a teenager. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I found out when you did," I managed to whisper, my voice thick with unshed tears. "I swear to you, Andrew, I didn't know any of this was coming. I thought she was leaving me a watch." He kept looking at me. I could physically see his mind working behind his eyes. That same methodical, brilliant processing speed his mother had possessed. The very trait that had made him such a ruthless and successful litigator. He was retroactively scanning every interaction, every dismissed phone call, every birthday card I had dutifully sent, every silent moment of rejection he had handed me. The math was finally adding up, and the sum was devastating. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked, the tears finally spilling over his lower lids. "All those years, all those goddamn phone calls where I treated you like garbage. You could have told me. You had the proof. Why didn't you defend yourself?" "Because she was your mother, Andrew," I said, leaning forward, the truth finally slipping free after a decade of captivity. "Because you were 17 years old. You needed her to be someone you could be fiercely proud of. You were building your own life, your own confidence. If I had destroyed her image, I would have destroyed your foundation. I wasn't going to take that from you, not for my own ego." He sat back down in his chair, moving slowly, like a man whose bones had suddenly turned to glass. He placed his large hands flat on the mahogany table and stared at them. When he finally looked up at me again, his face was wet, the stoic lawyer entirely stripped away. "I told people my father was a criminal," he wept, the confession tearing out of his throat. "I told my corporate clients when the subject inevitably came up in background checks. I told my friends. I told the woman I was in love with last year. I told her I had a complicated relationship with my father because he had made terrible, greedy choices and ruined our family. My God, Dad, you didn't know. I should have asked more questions. I am a lawyer. I never even looked at the goddamn evidence. You were 19 when I went in," I told him softly, aching to cross the room, but knowing he needed to process this in his own space. "And then you were 22, graduating law school, and you had a narrative that made perfect sense to you. People don't go actively looking for reasons to tear down the stories that make sense of their trauma. He pressed the heels of his hands brutally against his eyes, trying to stem the tide of tears. When he dropped his hands, he looked exhausted, completely hollowed out, like someone who had just put down a boulder they had been carrying uphill for 12 years. Sensing the profound intimacy of the fracture taking place, Rebecca Torres quietly excused herself. The other executives in the room, realizing they were suddenly trespassing on holy ground, rapidly gathered their files and practically fled the conference room. Within 3 minutes, the heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving just Andrew and me alone in the vast, quiet space, bathed in the sharp December sunlight falling through the towering glass windows. We sat there at opposite ends of the long table for a long time. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was thick with 1,000 unspoken apologies and a decade of lost time. "I don't know how to do this," Andrew finally said, his voice ragged. "I don't know how to be furiously angry at her when I just buried her, and I miss her so much. I don't know how to apologize to you for 12 years of cruelty when I don't even know where the hell to start. I don't even know who I am anymore. I don't know who I've been working so obsessively hard to become. If the thing I was rebelling against, if the monster I was trying not to be, wasn't even real." I stood up then. My knees popped in the quiet room. I walked the length of the table, the expensive carpet silencing my footsteps, until I stood beside him. I looked down at my son, a man who was simultaneously a stranger and the most familiar thing in my world. "You became a brilliant lawyer," I told him, my voice steady, injecting all the certainty I had into the words. "That is real. Whatever you built in Chicago, whatever reputation you earned, you built it with your own hands and your own mind. That doesn't magically go away just because the blueprint changed. I built it trying to be nothing like you," he confessed, looking up at me. He said it without a trace of cruelty. It was just a heartbreaking statement of fact. Disciplined, controlled, no mistakes, no emotional weakness. Every single decision by the book. He paused, a bitter, watery smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Turns out I was trying not to be a ghost. I was trying not to be someone who never even existed." I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and placed it firmly over his shoulder. I squeezed once. He didn't pull away. He leaned into the touch, tension in his broad shoulders collapsing just a fraction. "You're here now," I said quietly. "We are both here." He nodded, wiping a hand across his face, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. He didn't say anything else for a while, and neither did I. We just stayed there in the sunlit room, letting the truth settle around us like falling snow. We didn't leave each other's sight that evening. We walked out of the glass tower together and got dinner at a quiet, dimly lit steakhouse a few blocks from my hotel. We slid into a leather booth across from each other and ordered bourbon. And then the dam broke. We talked more in those 3 hours than we had in the entire previous decade combined. He talked about his high-pressure corporate cases, the apartment he had been living in alone in Chicago for the past 4 years, and the woman he had pushed away because he was too emotionally guarded to let her in. I listened. I just listened to the music of my son's voice. Eventually, the conversation softened, drifting back in time. He told me he still remembered being a little boy, coming to my cluttered engineering office on Saturday mornings when Eleanor had meetings. He remembered sitting cross-legged at the corner of my massive drafting table, using my expensive mechanical pencils to draw his own crude versions of skyscrapers on scrap copypaper while I worked. He smiled when he said it. He remembered. I sat there in the dim light of the restaurant, nursing my drink, utterly overwhelmed by the realization that beneath the anger and the lies, the boy who loved his father had been there all along, waiting to be found. I drove home to Charlotte the morning after that dinner, tires of my car eating up the miles while my mind tried to process the seismic shift in my reality. The following 3 months were unlike anything I had ever experienced. a surreal blur of aggressive corporate transitions and dizzying wealth. My tiny, sparse apartment was suddenly flooded with conference calls. Elite teams of corporate lawyers, high-end financial advisors, estate accountants filled my daily calendar, speaking in rapid, hushed tones about liquidations, asset transfers, and tax shelters. The estate was terrifyingly complex. There were commercial properties scattered across Tennessee, Georgia, and North Carolina, massive investment portfolios, and intricate business interests. The numbers they casually tossed across the table felt entirely fictional to a man who budgeted his groceries down to the dollar. I kept waking up at 4 a.m, my heart hammering against my ribs, absolutely certain there had been a catastrophic mistake. I felt like an imposter sitting on a throne of gold that belonged to someone else. But I remembered Eleanor's final directive. Before any of the massive wealth transfers were permanently finalized, before I bought a single thing for myself, I had to execute her one binding condition. I had to find James Whitfield. It took my newly retained legal team a few weeks to track him down through mutual contacts from the old industry days. He was living in Savannah, Georgia, quietly retired at 63. He had painstakingly rebuilt his career after the catastrophic Chattanooga collapse, rebuilding his reputation slowly, brick by painful brick, the way a man has to when he is forced to start over from the rubble. I didn't want to do this over the phone, but I had to make the initial contact. When I called, he picked up on the second ring. I told him who I was. There was a long, heavy silence on the line, the kind of silence that holds years of resentment. But he didn't hang up. He told me he always thought something was structurally wrong with the narrative of my guilt. I told him the truth, all of it. What Eleanor had done, what I had done to cover it up, and what Eleanor had finally admitted before she died. He listened without interrupting once, which told me everything I needed to know about the deep, enduring decency of the man. I flew to Savannah on a Thursday. We met in person, sitting on the wraparound porch of the modest, historic house he had bought for his retirement. We sat in wicker chairs, drinking iced tea, and talked for 6 hours straight as the humid Georgia afternoon faded into dusk. I apologized for my part in the cover-up, for the years he spent not knowing the truth, and for the financial ruin he had faced. He told me he had made his own choices, but he forgave me. By the end of that long afternoon, staring out at the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks, we had mapped out something profoundly important together. We decided to establish a massive philanthropic foundation funded entirely by Eleanor's estate, specifically focused on developing affordable, high-quality workforce housing across the Southeast. James agreed to come out of retirement to join the board of directors. His name would go on the foundation alongside hers. It was the perfect synthesis. It was what Eleanor had inherently been brilliant at. The raw economics of shelter, the complex business of home, but repurposed for genuine good. It was the kind of structural work that would outlast both of us. I immediately set aside $100 million from the estate to establish the foundation's permanent endowment. It was specifically structured to generate continuous grants and provide below-market financing for independent developers who were willing to build affordable units in marginalized communities that desperately needed them. James brought a lifetime of industry relationships and political goodwill that I simply didn't possess. I brought the capital and the engineering expertise. Together, we hired a brilliant, aggressive young staff and immediately got to work. Kept some of the money. Not extravagantly, because I had spent far too many years with very little to ever be comfortable with genuine excess. But I finally allowed myself to leave that cramped apartment. I bought a house in Asheville, North Carolina, nestled up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It wasn't a mansion. It was a beautiful, sturdy, 3-bedroom craftsman home with a large yard surrounded by ancient, towering oak trees. Most importantly, it had a massive, sun-drenched room with vaulted ceilings that I immediately converted into a proper engineering studio, complete with a state-of-the-art drafting table. Then, I did the hardest thing I had done since walking into that federal prison. I formally applied to the State Board of Engineers to get my professional license reinstated. The legal and bureaucratic process was agonizingly long, heavily scrutinized, and deeply uncertain. I had to sit before a panel of my peers and be interrogated about my conviction. But I had powerful character witnesses now. I had the forensic accounting proof of my actual innocence regarding the initial fraud. Eventually, after months of deliberation, the State Board comprehensively reviewed my incredibly unique case and granted me a conditional, heavily monitored restoration of my license. I was an engineer again. I could finally draw lines on paper that would become concrete and steel. I could design real projects, not just the phantom buildings that lived inside my head. Naturally, the newly formed foundation commissioned me as the lead structural engineer and architect to design our very first flagship development. It was an ambitious 48-unit, mixed-income residential complex located in East Nashville, just a few miles from the very neighborhood where Eleanor had first opened her tiny property management business with a used laptop. I poured every ounce of my soul into those blueprints. We broke ground on a crisp morning in early fall. The site was chaotic and beautiful, full of heavy machinery, local politicians, community members. Andrew drove all the way down from Chicago for the ceremony. He stood right next to me, shoulder to shoulder, while a representative from the mayor's office stood at a podium and said glowing, optimistic things about what this building would mean for the working families of the city. When it was my turn to speak to the crowd, I kept it brief. I stepped up to the microphone, looked out at the freshly turned red clay, and stated that this building was for Eleanor. I said it was her way of apologizing, which was the only way she ever knew how to communicate, through building something that would stand against the elements and last for generations. Afterward, when the crowds had dispersed and the catering tents were being taken down, Andrew and I walked the perimeter of the active construction site. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and wet earth. I unrolled a set of blueprints on the hood of my truck and pointed out the specific footprints of the foundation. I showed him exactly where the large community room would be, the central outdoor courtyard, and the small, raised bed garden the Future Tenants Association had already requested in our planning meetings.
She would have been incredibly proud of this, Dad. Not just the scale of it, but the mechanics. The way you've structured the financing to keep the rent permanently capped. She would have analyzed the spreadsheets for hours, Wasat, and then told you it was brilliant.
I like to think so. I tried to design it the way she would have wanted it built. Efficient, structurally sound, but with enough dignity in the aesthetics that people will actually want to come home to it. She was always far better with things that would last for decades than she was with things that were happening right in front of her.
That's the most accurate description of her I've ever heard. She could see 20 years into the future of a commercial district, but she couldn't see what was happening across her own kitchen table.
It was a blind spot. We all have them, Andrew. Mine was thinking I could absorb all the damage without it eventually bleeding out onto you.
You did what you thought you had to do to hold the roof up. I understand that now. I really do. It took me a long time to dismantle the anger, but looking at this site, looking at what you're building here, it helps. It makes the past feel less like a total loss.
That's the entire point of a foundation, son. You dig deep, you clear out the unstable soil, and you pour something solid so you can build upward again. He smiled at that. A small, wry, slightly sad smile that was a perfect replica of his mother's. We had been spending significantly more time together since that devastating day in the Nashville conference room. It wasn't a dramatic, overnight cinematic reconciliation. Neither of us was emotionally built for grand, sweeping gestures. It was a slow, deliberate reconstruction. We started with tentative phone calls that lasted longer than the mandated 4 minutes. We moved to occasional dinners when he was traveling for his firm. Then, he came to visit me in Asheville for a long weekend. He walked into my house, looked around at the sturdy furniture, and the quiet woods outside seemed to finally exhale. I took him into the studio and showed him the drafting table, which was currently buried under sprawling, highly detailed schematics for a community center we were planning for Atlanta. He stood in front of the massive table for a very long time, lightly tracing his fingers over the vellum paper, studying the precise geometry of the load-bearing walls I had sketched.
You were always designing something, weren't you? Even in that tiny apartment in Charlotte. Even when you were doing absolutely nothing else. When you had no license and no hope of anyone ever building it. You were still drawing.
I had to. If I stopped designing, if I stopped solving the structural puzzles in my head, I think I would have simply ceased to exist. I needed to have something I was building, even if it was just a phantom. It kept the math in my head organized when everything else was chaos.
I look at these drawings, Dad, and I realize how much I missed out on. I spent 12 years thinking of you as a destructive force. But these are beautiful. These are genuinely incredible designs. You have a gift.
Thank you, Andrew. That means more to me than any board certification ever could.
I want to help, not just with the legal compliance of the estate, but with the actual foundation. I have a massive network of corporate contacts in Chicago and New York. I know the tax laws around philanthropic development better than anyone at my firm. Let me bring my expertise to this. Let me help you build these.
I would love nothing more than to work beside you. The door is wide open. He did. Andrew threw himself into the foundation's operations with the exact same terrifying intensity and razor-sharp intellect he brought to his corporate litigation. He was undeniably Eleanor's son in his drive, but in his newfound willingness to admit when he was wrong, and in the deep, empathetic patience he had started to show with the chaotic uncertainty of urban development, I could see something else entirely. I could see the man he was always meant to become, finally freed from the suffocating, false narrative he had built his entire adult life around. A full year after Eleanor's death, our foundation held its first major annual fundraising event. It was a massive, elegant dinner for high-level donors, politicians, and community leaders, hosted in a grand ballroom in downtown Nashville. There were remarks from the Housing Secretary of Tennessee praising our initiative. And then, Andrew took the stage to give the keynote speech. I stood quietly at the very back of the glittering room, leaning against a marble pillar, and listened to my son. He spoke eloquently about his mother, praising her relentless vision, her unparalleled drive, and the miraculous way she had built an empire out of absolute nothing. And then the room went completely silent as he pivoted. He began to talk about the part he had aggressively left out of every version of that story for 20 years. He spoke, his voice thick with emotion, about a good man who had gone to federal prison quietly, who had lost his name and his family to protect the woman he loved, and who had come home to start over without a single word of complaint. He told the hundreds of wealthy donors in the room that the life-changing work of this foundation was, in a very real way, a son's profound apology to his father, and a father's final, beautiful gift to a woman who had desperately needed redeeming. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Afterward, when the applause had faded and the event slowly wound down, Andrew and I escaped the suffocating crowd. We stood outside together on the venue's expansive stone terrace. The Nashville night air was unseasonably warm, the way it often gets in late October, and the glittering lights of the sprawling city were spread out below us like a blanket of diamonds. He loosened his expensive silk tie and leaned heavily against the stone balustrade, looking exhausted but deeply at peace.
She would have absolutely hated this kind of event, you know. All these wealthy, pretentious people standing around, holding champagne flutes, just wanting to be seen giving their money away for the tax write-off.
She would have complained about it the entire ride here, yes. But she still would have worked the room flawlessly. She would have shaken every single hand, remembered everyone's name, and extracted maximum capital from every single one of them. She always knew the money was necessary to pour the concrete.
Yeah, she did. She was a force of nature.
We were quiet for a long while, listening to the faint hum of traffic from the streets below and the clinking of glasses from the ballroom behind us.
Dad, I've been thinking a lot lately about something. About the real reason why you did it. Why you took the blame and went to prison for her.
I told you why. I did it to protect her empire, and more importantly, to protect you. You were a boy about to go to college. You needed your mother.
I know that was the logical, engineered reason you gave yourself, but I don't think it's the core truth. Not the deepest part of it. I've spent my career analyzing human motivation, and the math on your sacrifice just doesn't add up to mere protection.
Then what does your analysis tell you?
You loved her. Not strategically. Not because you calculated the financial or social outcome. You just loved her with an absolute, terrifying completeness. And when the catastrophic moment finally came, when the walls were collapsing, you simply did what people do when they truly love someone. You stood directly in front of the impact to shield her. You threw yourself on the grenade.
I stood there on the terrace, feeling the warm wind against my face, and I thought about his words. I thought about the girl behind the hotel desk with the textbooks, and the heavy oak table where she had cried. I looked at my son, seeing so much of her in his eyes. That's about right, Andrew. I did love her, more than I loved myself.
I don't know if I've ever loved anyone that way, Dad. I don't know if I'm even capable of that kind of selfless surrender. I've spent so long guarding my own perimeter, making sure no one could get close enough to cause a structural failure.
It wasn't a statement of self-pity. It was just brutally honest. The kind of raw, unfiltered honesty he had been actively practicing more and more lately. It was the sound of a man recognizing his own flaws. You will, Andrew. You will love someone that way.
He looked at me sideways, a skeptical arch to his brow. How can you possibly know that?
Because you are entirely capable of it. Because you are my son. You've been fiercely standing in front of things your whole life, defending your firm, defending your mother's memory, defending your own independence. You have the protective instinct. You just didn't know whose corner you were actually allowed to stand in. Once you find the right person, you'll stand in front of the impact for them, too. He didn't answer that, but he didn't need to. The tension in his jaw relaxed. We stood there on the terrace for a long while longer, just a father and his son sharing the quiet night. When the evening finally wound down entirely and the last of the valet cars filtered out of the circular drive, we walked to our rental cars together. We hugged briefly, a real, solid embrace, and agreed to have dinner in Chicago the following week. I am 64 years old now. My engineering license has been fully and permanently restored by the State Board. The East Nashville housing development officially opened its doors in the spring. I stood at the bright, chaotic ribbon-cutting ceremony and shook hands with the actual families who would be moving into beautiful, safe homes they could actually afford. I looked at the solid brick, the wide windows, and the children running through the courtyard I had designed. I thought about all those phantom buildings I had obsessively designed in that spare room in Charlotte, the ones that no one ever built, the ones that existed only in my lonely imagination. And I thought that this, right here, was infinitely better. This was the right building. I still think about Eleanor often. I have finally made a profound, lasting peace with what she did in her panic and with what I did in my devotion, with the undeniable fact that neither of us handled the bitter years that followed particularly well. I don't obsess over the wasted time as often as I used to. The anger has evaporated. Instead, I try to focus my thoughts on what she wrote in the second letter she left for me, the private one, enclosed in the sealed envelope that nobody else in that conference room read. Victor, she had written in her sharp, elegant hand, I know exactly who you are. I know you'd rather give every single cent of this away, live on absolutely nothing in a cabin somewhere, and tell yourself that's the noble, righteous thing to do. So, I am specifically asking you not to. I am begging you to build something beautiful for yourself. Not for me, not for Andrew, not for some grand, philanthropic legacy to clear my conscience. You spent 30 years of your life quietly making space for everyone else's ambition and everyone else's survival. There is room left in this world for you. Please, Victor, use it. I kept that private letter folded in my jacket pocket for months. I still know exactly which drawer in my desk it rests in. James Whitfield and I had coffee just last month. His work with the foundation has become the thing he is most fiercely proud of in his long career. I take as a very good sign about the healing of both our souls. He told me that actively working on the housing projects, seeing the tangible results of our capital, had finally given him something productive to do with his lingering anger. It wasn't just a toxic poison anymore. It was fuel for the engine. I understood exactly what he meant. And then there is Andrew. He is getting married in the spring. He called me last week to tell me the news. His voice was lighter, happier than I had ever heard it.
Dad, I wanted you to be the first to know. Sarah and I are getting married. It's going to be in May, a small ceremony up in Wisconsin, near her family's place.
Andrew, that is incredible news. I am so incredibly happy for you both. She is a wonderful woman.
Thank you. Listen, I'm calling about the arrangements. I know we haven't talked about the logistics yet, but there's something I need to make very clear from the start.
Whatever you need, son. You just tell me.
I want you at the front, Dad. I want you in the very first row. Not hiding in the back of the auditorium like at graduation. Not slipping out early before the reception. Up front, with me.
I wouldn't miss it for the world. I will be right there in the front row. I hung up the phone and sat at my drafting table for a long time, looking out at the ancient oak trees in my yard. Last week, I completely finished the blueprints for a new design. A sprawling, light-filled community library for an underserved neighborhood in East Atlanta, commissioned by a local nonprofit that our foundation helped connect with a major donor. It is a real building, not a dream, not a phantom sketch to pass the lonely hours. It has funding, it has permits, and it will be built. When the concrete is poured and the walls go up, I will walk through its open doors. I will touch the solid walls. And I will think about Eleanor at 23, sitting in the front row of a cramped classroom, fiercely taking notes, working 3 exhausting jobs to build something out of absolute nothing, because survival was the only thing she knew how to do. I will think about the two of us in our first tiny, noisy apartment, 28 and 26 years old, absolutely and foolishly certain that we had all the time in the world to get it right. I will think about Andrew, standing at the altar in May, looking at me in the front row and calling me Dad. And I will look at the foundation I stand on now. I will think that this, all of it, the staggering loss, the heavy cost, and the long, agonizingly slow work of coming back from the dead, this is still a life. A real, solid, structurally sound life. The kind of life that is truly worth living. And finally, after all these years, I am living it.